Recordings in progress. All right. Oh, there he is. Hello, Mr. Flood. Right. Okay. Well, good evening and welcome to the February 8th meeting of the Capital Finance Community Task Force. My name is Cynthia Kress, and along with Jamie Finch, we're the chair and vice chair of this task force. I want to start by thanking Jamie for filling in for me last meeting. I think you all agree he did a fabulous job. It was a heavy lift. I also want to thank Jean and Andrea for staffing this task force throughout, and also particularly for their work of authoring the report. There's a lot to capture, and you've done it earnestly and thoughtfully, and I'm sure everyone in this task force agrees that we appreciate all that. And finally, I just want to thank all of you for your continued engagement and for committing your considerable energy and intellect to this work. We have obviously a lot to cover tonight, and tonight is a night we need to hash out and commit to the details and the nuances of this recommendation. We need to land this plane, so to speak. I encourage you to speak up and make your voice heard. Unlike earlier meetings, I think you'll see a little bit more pausing more often to take the temperature of the group and see if somebody suggests a comment. Maybe kind of look to the rest of the group to see, yes, we all agree that should go in, or maybe that should be under other considerations or minority opinions will be. So we'll really be kind of pressing a little bit. We don't have to reach consensus, but consensus is valuable. So we would want to be, trying to gauge that throughout. Go ahead and make your case. Put the chat about whether your comment, put in the chat if your comment is related to someone else's specific comment, and I'll do my best to manage a robust discussion. Please speak up if you think I've missed something. And perhaps someone's logic will persuade someone else to change their mind, but we won't be making any assumptions. We'll be pressing to make sure that the report fully reflects the degree to which we all agree or disagree. And Andrea and Jamie, feel free to help me out if you see I've missed someone, or really anybody else if you think I've missed something. So that concludes my opening remarks, and that brings us to the minutes. I am seeking approval of the minutes by unanimous consent as presented. I am hearing no objections, so the minutes are approved as presented. And that brings us to public comment. Juliana or Andrea, do we have any public comment this evening?
We do not have any guests in the participant tally tonight.
Is it appropriate to just call people's attention? Now, I guess I'm doing that to the late breaking email that just came from one of our community members. So just have a look at that. I don't think it, yeah, there was an individual that submitted some comments earlier, but hearing no public comments, we'll close public comment and move along to agenda item 4A1. And I guess I have a question for Andrea. Do you see this as being one item at a time, opening and closing, not closing, because this is still a discussion, but do you want to make sure that we're kind of clear about whether we're on question 1 before we move to question 2, or do you see them as, okay, so I'll do my best to try to make sure that we conclude before we move on to the subsequent one. So that looks like we're at the question about the levy lid lift. So, and Andrew, I don't know if you have other opening comments as well, but that concludes my opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Yes, we do. I would like to take these questions one at a time. And we also have some polls associated with the first question especially, but some of the other questions too, just to help understand what the general sentiment of the group is. So good evening, everybody. I'm Andrea Snyder, Deputy City Administrator. Jean Paul, our Management Analyst, is also with us this evening. And the CFO, Robert Hamoud, is also on hand if you have any questions of a financial nature. So I do have some opening remarks that I'd like to say, and really just about the report, that this is your opportunity to make sure that the report reflects your voice. And, it's not supposed to reflect my voice or Jean's voice or what the administration, we think we hear, that's the best that I tried to do, is ascertain what I thought I heard, but this is the time for you to correct me, or maybe I didn't hear you exactly right, and also elaborate on points as you see fit. So there's no ego attached for this report, so please do provide your feedback and changes. For many of these items, we really wove together things that conversations over the past several meetings, tried to find a middle or common ground. And some of those things may not be personally what you want, but it's reflective of the voice of the group. Some of those things, maybe we got the voice of the group wrong. So again, this is the time to correct those. And also note that there's room for dissenting opinions in the additional considerations and feedback section. So now is the time also to make sure your voice is heard on those items. We also, at the same time, while we want this to be reflective of the voice of the body of the task force, we want to ensure that we don't water down these recommendations so far that they're not useful. We still want to provide strong recommendations for City Council and for the mayor and administration that are actionable. And then, you know, depending on how these conversations go, I'd like to talk about what the next steps are after this meeting. If we really need another meeting to review comments from the report, that's going to depend on how the conversation tonight goes and how ready you feel the report is and how reflective you feel the report is from this conversation of the task force voice. So with that said, we do have just a very easy brief PowerPoint here just to help us keep focused on some of these questions. The first part of the evening tonight, I wanted to thank you, Jean, for sharing your screen. We can go to the next slide if you like. So today, of course, we are discussing these policy questions. There are some policy questions included in the agenda, and we want to get to those to make sure that these recommendations are as fleshed out as they can be for the administration's and council's consideration. So the first part of this evening really had anticipated being more of a facilitated conversation, making sure we have some of those bigger questions answered. And then I look forward to the second part of the evening on whatever other topics you want to bring up, whatever other areas of the report that you would like to discuss. Please bring those. I did ask for any input or feedback ahead of this evening on things that were not of a larger, substantive policy nature, and so I thank the members who provided that. I just want to summarize what those comments are and do a temperature check in the room for some changes. So one, there was a desire for some additional context and background on a few things that just wasn't mentioned in the report, but that we spent some time in our meetings discussing, including our discussion on the transportation bond and why we felt that the transportation bond failed when it did a couple of years ago, because that guided some of our discussions moving forward. So there's a desire to add information on that. Any opposition to adding more background on the transportation bond and summarizing the conversations we had in this meeting? Okay, I'm not seeing any. So okay, then also there was a desire for more context around the current climate and the discussions related to that on that traffic has been a #1 issue, that there's concerns about spending and the expense of living in Issaquah, and that there's some, the pandemic as being part of the context and overall feeling. So just to add more information on that to set up the context and climate of where Issaquah is today based off of the discussions that you've had. And I see that there's a comment, so I just want to pause.
Kathy, why don't you start?
Andrea, this is great information. Thank you. The kind of a
a last minute thought to enter, along with the other concerns about the climate and are we really ready to present this, is also, is the business community ready? And I say that more from a mental health perspective than anything. You know, businesses have gone through an awful lot the past few years, and but they're also voters. And if they're going to be looking at any sort of increases that impact them as a resident or as a business owner, just, you know, making sure that we're outreaching to them through this process, that they're feeling a part of it as well as our residents, I think is going to be really important. Simply because we're all in this together, right? And we want to make sure that as a community, holistically, we're reaching out to everyone, and everyone has a chance to be kind of brought into that. And our business owners and their employees are very much a part of our world and our life and our livelihood. And whether they live here in Issaquah or not, they work here, and they have been through a lot along with everyone else. And I just think it's important that their sensitivities be considered during this process as well.
Thanks, Kathy. Andrea, I was just going to make a comment that I wanted to make sure that you characterize, and as long as nobody is opposed to this, it's really about, it's the uncertainty. Then we have a great deal of uncertainty around how people might be experiencing the current, what we're calling climate. I'm not an economist, but you know, there's a real strange phenomenon happening with the economy, and we don't have it all figured out. And so we don't want to make assumptions about, I want to make sure that it's more about the uncertainty to how people might be feeling, because we don't really know. In a lot of cases, revenues are exceeding, and you know, property values are climbing, and you know, there's just all kind, it's there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and that's the thing I think we want to be sensitive rather than characterizing as necessarily everyone suffering, because it's definitely a strange economy at this time. It's about uncertainty. Thanks. And looks like Tim has a comment.
I was just going to chime in and say, you know, obviously Kathy is one of the leaders in terms of business voices from our community. The email we got just prior to this meeting was another, you know, business leader within the community. And, you know, she was largely supportive, it sounded like, of kind of our roadmap. But the one thing that she sort of highlighted by omission was the sales tax. And I think when I think, you know, business community impact, that's the one that there might be some opposition there. So to me, that's the correlation, is to understand as we evaluate the sales tax versus the other revenue methods, that would have sort of one strike against it, I think, potentially from some of the business community. Not to say we shouldn't consider it, but that would be sort of the part of the calculus.
Great, thank you. Moving on and summarizing some of the other comments that we heard, the priorities section and that recommendation on priorities to add, again, a little bit more context and background about the community survey, because that seemed to be a large part of the discussions at the time and helped really guide why transportation was chosen as the #1 priority by the task force. And so we can certainly provide more background information or pull some data from the community survey that was discussed at the task force. There was also a suggestion to remove some of the process that the task force went through in terms of the polling data. So those questions of, you know, what's most important to you as a task force member, and what do you think would be most important to the average Issaquah community member? And so there was a request to kind of pull that data, or at least take out some of the data around what do you think is most important to a community member. And so I wanted to ask the rest of the task force, is there strong feelings about keeping that in or taking it out? Any thoughts on that?
has a comment. Go ahead, Zach.
Thanks. I think Kathy was one before me, so I'm happy to let her go.
Sorry, Kathy, that must have been a second one. I Go ahead, Kathy, and then Zach right after her. Thanks.
I have lots to share tonight. No, I was just saying that I'm fine with the group, whatever they decide, but I do want to state that I believe in transparency. I don't think there's any reason why we should not share all of our polling. These meetings were recorded. I think they should be accessible, and I think it should be part of something that it's a process, you know, and I'm proud of the process we've gone through, and I'm proud of the fact that there wasn't clear consensus in the beginning. And so I just wanted to share, I think, again, given full transparency, that we've been asked to do this by the city, and that we should share all the information from all of these meetings.
Thanks. And then ditto that. And I was just going to say, with the table in particular for the criteria, I liked that it was in there because largely the top five are not the same as in number one is the same as number one, but the top five are the same essentially mix of criteria. And I thought that was very telling in showing that the task force is thinking in ways that are very similar to how a community member would be thinking. So I thought it was very valuable to keep in. Thanks.
Thanks, Zach. Mr. Voight, is that a question?
It is a question. Thank you, Chair. Just a real quick question, Deputy Administrator. When you're actually talking about including the polling, so those, I think we did it about 3 different times. Are you talking about including the questions to the polling, the responses, everything?
Great question. I am specifically referencing, let me find it in our recommendations here. I'm specifically referencing this chart that is on page 3 of the recommendations, where it's talking about the ranking of the criteria from the task force ranking perspective, and then the general community, or what task force members thought the general community, how they would rank these criteria. That's the chart that I'm talking about.
Okay, so we're not actually talking about the Insta polls that we came up with on the fly in the chat boxes. You're talking about table 1 and so forth, which I think is completely appropriate. Again, echoing Councilmember Hall and Kathy's points, transparency is great. I think more context helps everybody. And again, to Kathy's point, there's nothing here, you know, is out of the ordinary. I thought a lot of great work happened here. So, plus it's kind of a thin packet. We need more information. So when the city and everybody gets it, you know, it'll look like we actually did some work. It's not just 6 pages of numbers and things. So I think it's good. I really appreciate Tim's comments before, because again, I think it's all about context. And again, his point about the TBD sales tax, and prior to Kathy's suggestion about just being a little uncertain times. So all of that I think is quite appropriate. And I don't see any reason why we wouldn't want to include it. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad.
Thanks. I'm in favor of transparency, so I would leave it in. Basically, the only caution that I would make would be when we are speculating about what we think the community might feel. I think that's a pretty tough call to make. And I think overall, in some respects, any of our responses to that was probably related more to how we might feel as a community member, more so than as a community as a whole. So, you know, to phrase it something to be cautionary about that portion, I guess is the only thing that I would add. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. Councilor Martz.
Just +1 to the including of the data. I think that anonymous quantitative data is exactly the kind of stuff you want to have, right? You want to see what the strength was in the room without necessarily putting any individual people on the hook for, unlike council, where all of us are on the hook for every vote that we have. I find this data I think it would be very helpful to anybody looking to understand how we came up with our conclusions, and just valuable in and of itself. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to go next. And I just want to say that I think the data is valuable, the transparency is critical, but I just think that the way it flows, where it's discussion, it comes right after the discussion, you kind of bury the lead. So it's not really a discussion about the substance. It's goes right into something about the process. So I think it's just more a matter of burying the lead, and I would encourage you to put some more substance under the discussion, because if I were the reader, I would expect that part of the discussion to be more about what we cared about, and then include, but I +1 on all the transparency and data and so forth. And Susan, you're next. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I was actually one of the people who contributed this type of feedback to Andrea. So, and I appreciate the opportunity to kind of clarify, because it absolutely had nothing to do at all with transparency or a desire to be less than transparent. I was trying to make 2 points. I was trying to say that the flow of the logic of how we landed on transportation went immediately to this table. And I didn't really glean from this table why transportation was number 1 and why the others were 2 and 3. From this table, I was trying to say, I think where our group really got that from was the community survey and the 2x2 matrix and the satisfied versus not satisfied, which Andrea mentioned earlier. And so I think we all, or Andrea was proposing that we do include something about that as well, because that informed kind of how we got to transportation first. And so that was number 1. And so this chart with the task force ranking versus general community ranking felt at a lower priority to get to that conclusion compared to that other exercise. So that was number 1. Number 2 is, I remember going through that exercise, and I remember having a hard time distinguishing what I would say as a task force member and what I would say as a general community ranking. So just similar to what Brad was saying. And I felt like the difference between the two was really not that meaningful. And I suggested we just pick one column. I think the column that we felt probably most confident in is task force ranking. Here's how the task force felt. But then you're asking us to kind of project from just a N of 1 ourselves to what the entire community is thinking. And I would feel less comfortable defending my decision on the general community ranking, because it's just my guess of where I think the community, and the way it's presented in the table, it looks like it's data from the community. So because it was an exercise where we were sort of asked to answer as ourselves and then asked to answer as somebody else, if we want to keep both of them in there because we feel like the data is really compelling and it creates a real meaningful picture, then I think we have to spend time setting up the exercise. So right now it looks like task force, and then, oh, you took that very same list to the community and here's what the community said. And I just felt like that was a little misleading.
Thank you. Looks like the next 2 retracted their comments. Please speak up if I misunderstood, but I think we're ready to move on. Andrea, and I want to say, obviously, this is all incredibly important. I don't know how we're gonna move along, but let's all just do our best to keep moving along.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So I guess based off of those comments, we can add, again, more context to that exercise and describe it so that that's a lot more clear where that data came from. So thank you for that. Then there were some other comments that we received about wanting to have a discussion about the section regarding reappropriation of existing funds and how the city should be using existing revenues to help fund infrastructure. We had a brief discussion about that quite a few meetings ago, this person suggested maybe tonight we can use some time to have more of that discussion, and then more discussion around the Parks District, which we have on our schedule to do tonight, and more discussion to clarify timeframes for implementation, and just that we, for example, taking the Parks District into account, if we're doing that 6 years out, then maybe starting implementation now or planning process now is a little bit too soon. Maybe we can wait a little bit more for that. So we can discuss that a little bit. I think that that probably makes sense. So those are some general feedback and ideas. Again, some of those things that we'll be discussing a little bit later tonight. And so thank you for those of you who provided some of your comments and insight ahead of time. That was great to read your comments. So moving on from those, I'd really like to dive into some of the bigger policy questions that we had when writing the report. We realized we didn't really quite nail this down. And so wanted to, I highlighted these in the report for you to think about, and would love to hear your comments and opinions this evening. So we have the levy lid lift and the Transportation Benefit District sales tax. The task force has prioritized the levy lid lift in our previous meeting and the TBD sales tax for the medium term. That's was suggested, I think, through a couple of different votes in a couple of different ways. That was the recommendation. So what we did not talk about, or at least come to a conclusion on, is where the revenues from the levy lid lift would go. There were some suggestions made by a couple of our members that TBD sales tax and levy lid lift would be complementary of each other, and would both be used towards transportation, and that would be kind of part of the package deal for the city to consider in terms of funding transportation, those two things used together. But we didn't, like I said, we didn't come to a consensus on that, and we didn't really discuss that any further. And so wanted to call that out for your attention tonight and discuss what the options were to use the levy lid lift. If you recall from some of our previous conversations about this tool, it is a property tax that is very flexible. It's probably the most flexible of all the revenue tools that we've discussed, and could be applied really towards any project. Of course, it would also be a vote to the people as to whether or not the property tax could be increased in this way. And so the question that I'd have for you this evening is, does the task force want the city to pursue both options, the levy lid lift and the TBD sales tax for transportation, or does the task force prefer the levy lid lift go towards parks or facilities or a mix of projects? And that is the question. So I'm just wondering, any opinions on this item so we can provide a recommendation to City Council?
Jamie, start us off.
Thank you, Cynthia. My assumption on the levy lid lift and the TBD sales tax, or at least my recommendation, was that I thought we should do one or the other to support transportation. I wouldn't support doing both. I just think that if we're trying to get something passed, we should focus on a very strong package for that specific revenue tool. And I also think there was a lot of discussion around making sure that we prioritize getting something passed for transportation. So if we were to go out with a levy lid lift for something else, I'm just not sure that that fits that in with that goal. So I would be in support of choosing between the levy lid lift and the TBD sales tax for transportation, but not doing both around the same time. Thank you.
Tim, you're next.
I guess I would echo what Jamie's comment there, kind of one or the other, just for the sake of giving us the best chance of passing. I would lean toward the levy lid lift just for the amount, which would give us the biggest impact. To formulate a real opinion, it would be good to just see that table, that chart of what the potential revenues are and the different kind of levers that we have. But in my opinion, yeah, go with the levy lid lift. at or close to the maximum, that we discussed earlier, and put some good messaging behind that rather than ask the voters for multiple funding sources.
So before I go on to Mr. Voice, I think what we should do is, Andrea, tell me if you agree, everyone should go ahead and say what they thought. And it sounds like a poll is what we're going to be doing on this one because we aren't agreeing, which is awesome. We don't have to agree. But I also think that we should be, I think it's appropriate to try to be providing your recommendation and why you think that. And then if anyone wants to respond, and then when we've had enough of it, then we'll, or it seems like we could do this all night, but rather than do it all night, let's, everybody make a earnest pitch, make it brief, and then we'll hand it to Andrea for the poll. Does that sound good? Okay, because I'm sure we all have lots of strong things to say. And I'm sorry, I think it's Mr. Voice next, and then Brad after him.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Just to echo Tim's comments, I think that's, again, I'm kind of in favor of one, not both. I do agree with, I believe it was the last meeting where we talked about, really having a strong message, come up with a viable package, and then, put all the resources that the city has to get it passed. And if the levy lid lift is what gives us the maximum amount of revenue, that'd be the one I would go with. I do think the timing is about right, medium term. And it goes back to what we were talking about a little earlier. If the city wanted to start planning within a year, maybe wait a year and then start planning for it to see it pass maybe in the third or fourth year, I think that'd be fine. I just think, again, I'm going back to where we were talking about uncertainty. And as we're climbing out of multiple different, I don't even want to say crises because I believe the chair got it right, just uncertainties. People are, I just I just heard something on local news the other night about the eviction moratoriums, which really don't have as big of an impact in Issaquah as they might in Seattle. But again, it's something people are thinking about. The cost of groceries going up. Again, something people are thinking about. So I just want to be sensitive to that because, again, a lot of people have a lot on the plate. We're climbing out of a once in 100-year pandemic. So hopefully this will be the year we climb out of it and we can all meet in person. But just with all of those little balls in the air, I think it's appropriate for a medium-term look, and it also gives the city and the administration time to come up with a good package that everyone could get behind because it's going to need to be, brought to the public for a vote. So I kind of like the levy lid lift because, again, it could bring in more revenue. I think doing two would probably be just too much, and then you could actually see both of them fail. So I'm going to echo what Tim and Jamie mentioned. Thanks.
Brad, thanks.
I guess I would just be in favor of TBD for transportation rather than to involve levy lid lift for this main reason would be if you try and do a levy lid lift on transportation, it would be probably harder in a few years after that to do another levy lid lift for facilities and the park district. And so I think the levy lid lift would be more appropriate for facilities in park district. Keep transportation TBD only. And that's my thoughts on that one.
Thanks, Brad. Kathy?
So I guess I'm looking at this a little bit differently. I don't think when we say midway and we say a medium a goal, I don't look at it happening all at the same time. But I do think the conversation needs to be an all-in. I think it should be a transportation sales tax and a levy lid lift, and I think the levy lid lift should be versatile and left open to all opportunities. I think that it's how we educate people, and the process being is if you look at those buckets, there's a lot that this community needs and wants. And we have a very sophisticated, intelligent community. They're going to put this together and they're going to know that it's not just a one-stop shop. We're going to need to kind of make all of this happen. And I think in that sense, we can drive a very compelling argument for the reason to do both. And I think you're going to get more buy-in from the business community on a sales tax for transportation if they know that there's also a levy lid lift in the thought process too, to help pay for more transportation and or parks and or facilities. Those buckets aren't going away. Those buckets are there, they exist, there are needs that exist, and I think that we can get there together. Given a few years that we're saying our timeline is to make this happen. So I think it's, I don't know, maybe more optimistic on my part, but I think it's doable.
Thanks, Kathy. Susan?
Yeah, I'm also in favor of the combined effort, the sales tax and the property tax. And in addition to the reasons that were just mentioned, I think there's almost a bit of a fairness, everybody has skin in the game kind of approach, because when you do property tax, obviously it's just the people who live here. And when you do sales tax, if I'm understanding this correctly, you also capture a slightly broader net of people who pass through, who shop here, who may come from neighboring communities. I am a little concerned that we can get all the way we need to get with a sales tax. So that's why I was suggesting a little bit of a balanced situation. And I feel like if we make the right explanation and reasoning to the public, that it doesn't have to be an either or. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. I was going to make some similar arguments as Kathy and Susan just made, but since we get to vote in a poll in a few minutes, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Zach. Thanks. Looks like Zach has got a connection problem and we just lost Susan. So a couple of people dropped on my screen. Are other people seeing the same problem? Okay. I hope they can hear us. I'm going to take a risk and assume they can hear us. And maybe Councilmember Martz, if you want to go, and then we'll try to.
You were about.
Oh. Hey, Zach.
Okay, did I cut out?
For quite some time. We didn't hear anything.
Okay, everyone's picture went away and I said, you know what, I'm just going to keep going and we'll see what happens. All right, so I'll start over. Thank you. So I want to look back at my notes from the last meeting, and I had, shared that I was in favor of the TBD sales tax. I'd actually talked about pairing that with a bond, so then we have funding for projects ready, and then we have a dedicated funding source to pay off a bond. So I'm not sure if maybe that just wasn't supported by others. Oh, everyone's camera just turned off again.
I can hear you.
Oh, good, you can hear me.
See you.
It's the Highlands,
See you,
because same thing is happening to me, and I'm also in the Highlands.
Turning off my camera to see if that helps. And I'm worried about potential property tax fatigue when we go out for a parks district in the future too. So I think a sales tax might be the right path. Although I do have some more comments on that for recommendation 6 in the report that I'll share later. And then I had talked about also the TBD sales tax being paired with a bond. So we have a dedicated funding source to pair off a bond. And those are my comments.
Thank you. Councilwoman Martz?
Thank you. I'm fine with both. To me, it's about at some point voters are going to have a piece of paper in front of them, and they're going to have to put an oval in a circle, and they're going to have to decide which circle to put an oval in. And it's going to be about what do they think they're going to get, right? And if you say we're going to have a 10th Avenue overcross and it's going to solve transportation, they'll put the oval that says yes. So I think you want to preserve the breadth of funding options as we go forward. I think there's enough support for both of these options from this group, whether there's unanimity or not. I've heard good arguments for both of them. The argument for the sales tax is it captures more of the people that actually contribute to traffic in our city. The argument for the levy lid lift is it's more progressive and hits more on the people who can afford it, as opposed to everybody, like on a sales tax. So I think that as a body, if I'm comfortable saying this body has had lots of good arguments for both of these, but it's really going to come down to, in the end, is it a combination of funding sources and funding projects that gets that oval, right? That gets people to choose the oval that says they want to do it. And if you just say we want to raise your taxes because stuff is expensive, I guarantee you they'll say no. Thanks.
Stacy.
Thanks. I'll be quick. I have concerns about putting both of them out at the same time. I think it's too much for voters. I think we potentially appear greedy. Greedy seems like a little overreaching word, but certainly if you've got 2 things on the ballot and you've got a whole bunch of stuff to do, it's not sure we can get it all done anyway. I would prefer to see them spaced out a bit. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, guys. Andrea, you ready to do something?
Great, really helpful. We are getting the poll together with, we had anticipated other parts of the conversation, so I'm just changing the poll a little bit to really reflect what I've heard this evening. And so give me 1 or 2 minutes as I make a few changes with Juliana, and she'll put the poll up. So just 1 or 2 minutes.
I'm ready, Andrea, if you are.
I think I want to change one more thing, but thanks, just 1 second. Okay, so while Juliana's pulling up the poll, there's a bunch of options that you're going to see to choose from, and some of those things weren't mentioned tonight. Because the levy lid lift revenues can go towards all kinds of projects, and I know we've been really focused on transportation, but also on the list of options that you'll see to choose from are facilities and parks, since those are the other priorities that you have discussed. And so I didn't want to assume that they were not part of the conversation. So you'll see that in the polling question. So the general question is, what do we do with levy lid lift revenues? Do we have it in tandem with transportation TBD? Do we a levy lid lift instead of a TBD? Should revenues go towards facilities, since no other revenue tool has been assigned specifically to facilities? Does it go to parks? Or does it go to a mix of projects across the buckets? Or finally, do we not charge a levy lid lift at all? So those are the questions. It's a big poll, forgive me. Trying to do this a little bit on the fly based on the conversations that I heard this evening and not wanting to rule out any options. So with that, Juliana, as soon as you're ready, it'd be great to pull that up.
Okay, it's open now.
While we're voting, I'll just ask the chair, Cynthia, real quick. Was any of my feedback understandable at all? Okay, good, thanks.
I'm glad that others were quicker than me. I was trying to figure out if you were asking about the quality of the discourse or the feed.
Okay, I'm going to close the poll and I will do my best to read you the options. The text is very small. So we had 3 votes in favor of A, which is transportation with the TBD sales tax. We had 2 votes in favor of the levy lift revenues going to transportation instead of TBD sales tax. 0 votes for facilities, 0 votes for parks, 4 votes for a mix of projects across buckets, and 2 votes saying that we should not move forward with a levy lift.
Great, thank you, Juliana. Appreciate that. Not a clear majority here. It seems like the most number of votes went to a mix of projects, which we have also not really discussed this evening, with the second runner-up being to take the levy lift and a TBD sales tax, both to fund transportation projects. And so would love to hear a discussion from those who voted for E, which is the mix of projects, since I think we have not heard that expressed this evening. Oh, great, we can actually see those results. Thank you, Juliana. Appreciate that.
Jason, is that a C for comment?
Apple shortcut C for comment. Just so I guess since I was one of the 4, is again kind of going back to midterm, long term. Is the midterm, for the levy lift, if that works to help spread it across the buckets, and then if we wanted to do a TBD either around the same time or a little bit after, that's kind of always been my thinking. Parks District, I kind of have always just felt that that was going to help facilitate parks, and again, that might be medium term or long, but that's like you had mentioned, is we really don't have any funding source for facilities or utilities, even though we've kind of taken utilities off the map. So that's kind of was my thinking. Is again, I've always been thinking like, let Issaquah have the next year or 2 to kind of put their house back in order, restaff, get some more resources back into City Hall, get people meeting again, where minds can actually start getting together and putting these things together, but making the city whole again for the next year or so. And then being able to start planning some of these big initiatives that again will need a wonderful communication aspect to it. That's going to be needed to go out and be sold by various people, whether it's city council or the administration. All the things that need to go in to make it a successful vote. So that was kind of my thinking behind it.
Thanks. Kathy, go ahead.
So similarly, I was thinking, I voted for across all the buckets. We're talking about something that may happen a few years into the future. I don't know what we will decide to do with our federal monies that we've received. I don't know what will be available in grants, if there's going to be other federal funds that will be coming available. And things are moving so quickly. What will be our needs in 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years? And what will be the community's temperature with all of those needs? And so I think the reason for my voting the way I did is to keep flexible about this. And we know today transportation is the major concern. If it's still the major concern, by the time our city council gets to this, I trust in them to make those decisions, because they're still going to be reaching out to the community and finding out what the community wants. And I think they should have that flexibility. And I don't feel comfortable necessarily with locking it in so strongly into just a all-in transportation, nothing else, knowing that we've got a midterm project goal here. So I just felt we needed to give somebody else that flexibility, being City Council, to address the needs as they exist, again, when they get there.
Thanks, Brad.
Yeah, kind of along the lines of what Kathy said, I like the concept of flexibility really the most. And I think that I just think a levy lift is more appropriate for facilities and parks, and perhaps not as much so for transportation. I just don't know that you can tag that into all three priorities. It's going to be enough of a stretch to tag it into facilities and parks as it is. So, but that does give flexibility if you just don't put it on one category or one priority. The amount is to be established through an awful lot deeper dive in all of these areas, I think. And I think if you provide that flexibility, then once you get into a deeper dive, then you can determine, how much is really needed in, from that revenue tool. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I think you were still asking about the four of us that voted for the that one and the combination. And the reason I voted for the combination is similar with regard to flexibility, but it also comes from a perspective TBD plus a levy lid lift, a companion package, maybe perhaps messaged as a companion package that distributes the who pays and who benefits, across a more equitable package, but also the idea that you want to be big somewhere. And so we would want to know, because the sales tax would only get you part of the way towards the existing deficit, and having transportation be able to, levy lid lift be able to shore that up, but also have the flexibility if you are getting, for example, the federal and state funding that you need, and or projects are coming in less, which inflation is maybe going to make that quite a bit harder, but stranger things have happened, that you have the flexibility then to start diverting that to other projects. But the slight twist in what folks were saying, it's just, I think it's important to be big somewhere. So the companion between paying for transportation from two different kinds of sources was why I voted for that. And I also just want to point out that there were 7 votes for using some combination of, I need to go look at the poll again. The first one was, so there were really 7 votes for the levy lift to go at least partially towards transportation. And so I thought that was at least makes it seem not quite so distributed as it does at first pass. You can kind of group those two in a way. Thanks. It looks like the chat, yes. I'm not seeing another comment in the chat. So it sounds like maybe except Jamie has a question.
Yeah, I was curious for the rest of the members, just whether we were thinking about that, like a levy lid lift. And I can't remember, did the question mention timing, or was it just generally a levy lid lift?
The question had the assumption of a medium term, because that was something that the task force had voted on last time, so that medium time frame. And so it assumed that in the question.
Gotcha. Okay. I'm just confused because I was hearing different things about not wanting to do like both during medium term, but that seems to go in conflict with what the poll results were. So I just wanted to make sure that that was how everyone was approaching the question, because I don't know if it said that explicitly in the question.
That seems like an important point. I'm afraid to move on to the next one. Andrea, it sounds like we're kind of divided. Could we say that, does everyone feel like this needs more homework about what to put, whether these should be companion and come in a similar campaign, or whether they should be sequential in the medium-term window. I feel like we could discuss this all evening, but I think it feels premature, and maybe we say that we couldn't come to it was premature to come to a conclusion about whether they would literally be in the same cycle or whether they would be staggered. I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but I just see us. I feel like this is not very difficult to answer right now.
I have a suggestion.
Please.
All right. Okay. It is a good question about which term, near term, medium term, or long term. We could discuss this a bunch more, and if the task force wants to do that, we'll make the time to do that. My suggestion is kind of dovetailing off of your observation, Cynthia, which is that it seems like the majority of the task force members are in favor of a levy lid lift and using that tool. Only 4 said, I'm sorry, no, only 2 had said not to use a levy lid lift. And so there does seem to be general support about this tool. And it seems as though the most discussion is coalescing around whether or not it should be used and focused on transportation, or if it should be used for a mix of projects. And so what we could do is we could do another vote between those 2 options and say, if we are to use a levy lid lift, should it be with transportation or should it be applied to a mix of projects? And that might help us get to a more solid recommendation. Or we could have at our next meeting more conversation over the timing of a levy lid lift as a tool. Those are kind of the options as I see them.
Cynthia, can I just hop in, because I think my question had prompted this, because part of, like, I was one of the people that responded not to do a levy lid lift, but I was only thinking about that in the midterm. That's not that I have that I'm against it at any point. It was, I was thinking very specifically about the midterm question. And so that was just some context on how I was thinking about it. I'm just not sure that everyone else was thinking about it with that context when they were answering. And if anyone, there's other comments, so I'd be interested in what other people think. But that was what I was curious about, was whether we were all thinking about this with the same lens.
I'm a little bit at a loss. Tim, did you have something on this specific?
Yeah, I guess I'm struggling with the long term or the medium term versus the short term for this. I think in reality, if we give a green light to something and there's consensus, we say levy lid lift, let's put it in motion and get it going. It's 2 or 3 years before there's shovels in the ground in the best of times, right? And if we kick the can down to medium term or long term, who's to say there's not a different mayor and city council and task force and everything? And then what have we really accomplished, right? I struggle with looking that far out with this group and this process. I think, we should, have a mindset of what that strategy ought to be, but also come out of here with something tangible that's short term, that we should take action, and not come out of here with our recommendation being, let's wait a couple years, revisit it, and then maybe do something. I struggle with that. I really want to, I don't know, I just have this bias for action that I think we know that that's our top priority. We've got all of our best minds that put all this work into this process. Let's come out of here with something where we can hang our hats on something where we're really making a difference. And if the voters shoot it down, so be it, but not be afraid to go ask for it.
Thanks, Councilmember Martz.
Thanks. So the challenge here is that even by saying, okay, let's talk about levy lid lift, it's still a 4-dimensional problem. It's, do you do it with a sales tax? If so, are they simultaneous? You have the sequencing of short, medium, or long term. And then do you spend that money just on transportation or on other things? So that's 2 times 2 times 3 times 2 is 6 by 4 is 24 options, right? So I think we should try to. I don't know if we're gonna get through all of that either today or at any meeting. I would like to suggest we get as far as possible today and ask more questions today. I would love our next meeting to be with as close to final language as we can and get the hard questions done today, if at all possible. So I'm going to stop talking. Thank you.
I think, Andrea, I think I'm doing your job for a second. I think what I'm hearing is that we're not super far apart, but there's just a lot of options within this range. I mean, we talked about medium term, we talked about, yeah. So I guess I'm not really sure where we are with the answer to this question. I feel like we're getting closer to the full side, but there's a lot of, and so I guess my question is, do you have what you need? Because I'm glad I'm not in your shoes.
So perhaps we can break it down and still answer this question first of what should we do with the levy lid lift revenues? Because it seems like it's a tool we want to use in general. And then once we determine what we want to do with them, then we can talk about at what time period it's appropriate to pursue this tool. And I think that taking those things somewhat one step at a time, I think might be helpful because whether or not you want to apply it to transportation, you could do that in the short term, you could do that in the medium term, right? So, so that's what I would suggest, that we continue on this journey of trying to answer that question of what do you want to do with these revenues? And then we can answer the question of really what is the preferred term, especially taken into context with the other recommendations that you have, right? So does that sound like a reasonable way to proceed?
Yeah, I think so. Did you say you were going to narrow it down and just do another poll? Okay. So it sounds like we're ready to do that. Oh, Jamie has a question. Jamie always has good questions. Go ahead, Jamie.
Thank you. Don't know if I can take that, but Andrea, I was just curious, should we be operating in this poll under the assumption that we're doing a TBD sales tax and a Parks Metropolitan District? What are our assumptions for the response to this? Because that would, I think, inform answers.
Yes, I think those are the assumptions. So I think what I have heard from this task force is support of TBD sales tax. Not everybody supports it, but I've heard a majority supports a TBD sales tax. That's what we covered last time. And I've also heard that a majority supports the Parks District. So I think we need to move ahead with those recommendations and assume that they are still recommendations. And so you'd be voting within the context of a Parks District and a TBD sales tax. Okay, and unless there's any more questions or any final comments before the vote, then I think, Juliana, we're ready. So if you could post the poll, that would be great. And as I said before, we really narrowed down these options to what I saw in terms of the trends of the discussion and where the votes of the previous poll had fallen. So it's where should levy lid lift revenues be applied, since the majority seem to be in favor of a levy lid lift? Is it transportation with a TBD sales tax, or a mix of projects across buckets? And if looks like there's difficulty with these choices, so we'll discuss after the poll.
Okay, everyone has answered, so I'm going to close the poll and I will share the results with you. Can you see those, or shall I read them?
We can see them, thank you. So it looks like transportation with a TBD sales tax has 6 votes, and then a mix of projects has 5 votes, and we still have a bunch of folks who have not answered.
There are only 11, there's 11 task force members.
Oh,
So you
okay,
get
I
11
see.
answers from task
Great.
force members.
Thank you for the clarification. Yes.
Is it helpful to say how many people, I was actually on the fence. Is anybody else on the fence? I could have just as easily gone with A and that would have been 7-4. Anyone else? Well, a poll about the poll, never mind. It's very close.
Can I say I would have liked to have another option, because I think sales tax should go towards transportation, but I think that levy lid is the one. If you're going to put non-transportation issues in, it should come out of uh, levy lid lift, not sales tax, if possible. So I would have wanted another option, because transportation is regional and the sales tax is regional. So that's my thought.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Martz, can I just ask clarification? Because I don't think I quite understood your point. What was the other option that you would prefer to have?
Well, the options, the way I read it, the way I would want it to work is the one that should, if either option should be focused around transportation, it should be the sales tax, because that's regional and transportation is a regional issue, but parks are too, but infrastructure is certainly city specific, right? Which is the same as a levy lift, right? So this question sort of said, like, would you want the levy lid lift to be focused just on transportation? I'm like, if something's going to be focused just on transportation, I'd want it to be a sales tax, not the levy lift. So that was not an option that I had in front of me.
Understood. Thanks.
So does that mean we're not done yet?
I think there are some other comments.
Sorry, the chat goes away. Sorry, the chat gets a little, sorry about that. No, or these are new ones. Sorry, the chat got small with the poll up there. Sorry. Now I have no idea who is first. That's like 706. You commented. Then Kathy, I think, is next. Is that correct? Sorry, the disappearing comment. Chats. I beg your pardon.
Yeah, it's hard going back and forth, so no worries at all. I felt like the question was a little bit confusing. If we were just talking about levy lid lift, you know, when you say transportation and sales tax, it would have been easier and less confusing for me if it was just asking that simple question as far as the levy lid lift. Should it be all transportation or a mix? Because I kind of agree with Tola. The way it was worded was, we have to have it all in and the sales tax, or we just have the levy lid lift across all buckets. And I don't think that's what you were asking. So, but leaving that sales tax tag to transportation made it a little bit confusing for me. I still voted for across all buckets, because I'm just assuming that we were just talking about levy lid lift and how would it be spent, not whether it's tied directly to transportation or not. So maybe I would change my answer if there was a different way to interpret that. So I don't know.
Stacy's next, but I just want to say that I think one of the things that we're trying to do is, we already had an answer for the TBD sales tax, and we're trying not to rehash, cover the same ground. I respect Tim's comment about the timing on the levy lid lift, but that was ground that we covered last meeting. I think the goal was to not recover the same ground. If we want to reopen things, it's certainly our prerogative, but I don't think we should be doing that willy-nilly. because if we've covered some ground, I mean, yeah. So I think that's why it might seem confusing or unnecessarily narrow, is because I think these are the outstanding questions after we hashed out a lot of the other ones already. So with that in mind, Stacy, go ahead and go next.
Can we see the question again? Is it possible to see it again?
I don't know that it's possible to see it again, but I can paste it into the chat.
Okay, or read it. I just want to make sure.
The question was, where should levy lid lift revenues be applied?
And answer A was transportation along with TBD sales tax, right?
That's right.
So I chose number A, and the reason I did was because of those choices, I was persuaded by Tim's comment that in my head was basically, go big or go home. And the mix on the number B seemed blah to me. Let's just kind of sprinkle stuff around. But if transportation is the number one issue and has been for 25 years or longer, then it seemed to me that if those were my choices, levy lid lift could be for local projects, things that are really directed at sort of local transportation, and the sales tax could be for regional projects. So that's the reason I voted the way I did.
Thank you, Stacy. Jason.
Thank you, and great comments from everybody. One thing Councilmember Mart said that kind of struck me is, again, I like the idea of the TBD because originally I didn't even like that tool at all. I think it was Councilmember Martz that actually got me to come around to understanding when he made that comment that is still stuck in my craw all these weeks later. 50% of the people that use our infrastructure don't live in Issaquah. So that to me seems like a very appropriate tool to use to target transportation. The levy lid lift, I kind of like the idea of giving flexibility to the council. Now that means they could still use it for transportation. They could buttress a project if they want, but I like the idea of it being a mix across projects. And then the other thing I'll say is, again, the way I've seen kind of the timeline, and this is just me, is I see the next 1 to 3 years, basically the city getting whole again, using ARPA funds, using state grants, federal grants, using the end of fund general balance, which I know we haven't talked about today, but that's also another thing, to get some of our transportation needs met now. Then I see possibly the levy lid lift coming in around year 3. And those can also, like I said, mix of projects. It can buttress a transportation project. It can use the facilities because those definitely are only being used mostly by property owners. And then maybe in year 5, once businesses have recovered, people are up and mobile again, then maybe you go with the big sales tax. The Metropolitan Parks District is an interesting one. I still believe it's a tool that should be used, but because it's a very foreign concept to me, and I still haven't completely wrapped my head around it, I see that as long-term. That's in year 7 or 8. I know everybody wants to do something, but sometimes the worst thing governments can do is do something. Sometimes it's nice when they actually sit back, catch their breath, and let everybody, including all of the residents, catch their breath. And like I said, it's not that I, want us to pass a blase report that says, yeah, everybody take the next 6 years off. We'll just kind of handle it. But again, I do think, like I said, we're living in a very particular time where people are nervous about different things. So again, I kind of see the next, year 0 to year 3, just kind of cleaning house, taking care of house, using our different little discretionary funds where we have them. Even, I know we don't like to say this, but even the camera revenues, that can go to transportation, and that can start within a year. And then, like I said, maybe around year 3, which you can start planning for within a year, you start doing the levy. And then again, TBD, because I do agree. I mean, it is wild how many people use our infrastructure who don't live here. So I do think it's an appropriate, and I think all 3 are appropriate tools. I think timing is a big one. And sometimes I know everybody wants to go big, put together a big package, but if a big package fails, you don't get the opportunity to look back and go, what did we do right? What did we do wrong to make sure we do it correct in the future? At least breaking them down into 3, if the first one goes successfully, you know what you want to repeat. And if it doesn't, you know what not to repeat. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks, Cynthia. I do wonder if we're asking the right question around levy lid lift. And the way I would frame that up is should the second response be a mix of projects across buckets, or should it be flexibility? Should the response or that the response be and the choice be between committing it to transportation versus keeping it open to what the priority is at the time? Because I think what is really challenging for me is I don't understand how you could do a levy lid lift that's compelling to people that's actually a mix of projects. How I think it's already gonna be hard enough to get something passed that is focused on one thing to make it ambitious and visionary was something that we focused on early. So I just wonder if we're asking the right question. Is it really, we know that we want to do the TBD sales tax for transportation. We know we want to do the Metropolitan Parks District for parks. And then we're not sure what comes after that. And then we don't want to commit. Is that option B versus a mix of projects across buckets? Because I think if you had provided that second option, I would have been, I didn't really, if I could have not chosen one on the last poll, I would have not chosen one. And I think it's because I don't know, and I want to make sure that I feel like we have our, at least in my mind, we have our priorities set for revenue tools and the buckets, and I'm just not sure what happens after that and wanting to commit us to doing that. So it's more about flexibility than trying to put a focus today.
I'm going to scratch my comment. But so that leaves us, if I'm managing the chat properly, to a point where maybe just show of hands whether you want to do Jamie's suggestion of another poll. Was there an option that Jamie suggested that yeah, okay. Sounds like we're going to do another poll. Is that a hand raise? Sorry.
Sorry, I have a suggestion.
Great.
And my suggestion is based off of what I'm hearing tonight and how close it is. What I'm hearing overall is mostly what I think Jamie just said, which is the recommendation is we have these prioritized tools of revenue that we know majority of the body knows we want to recommend for these purposes during these timeframes. The levy lid lift tool is still a tool that we think is something that the city should consider. And we don't have any other specific recommendations, but here are some of our thoughts about it. Our thoughts are that it could be used in tandem with a TBD sales tax, could be used for a mix of projects, could be used in the short term, could be used in a medium term. It's a tool that's worthy of your consideration, but we don't have any more specifics around it than that. And then to also provide all of the thoughts and discussion, summary of that you have discussed tonight. So that's how I would maybe recommend moving forward, because I don't know that we're going to be able to put any finer of a point on it this evening, given the conversations that we've had. Does that sound like a reasonable way to proceed? Getting mostly thumbs up and head nods. So, okay, great. So we will return to you next time with more discussion on the levy lid lift within the report, detailing it just as I described. Great. Thank you so much for working through it. These are hard conversations. It's all, you have to think about the strategy, and there's so many different variables. So it's not easy stuff that we're asking for tonight. So really appreciate you sticking through it. Jean, if you could pull up the slides again, I think we have another question. It's 7:20, so a bit of a time check, but this one I think was probably the hardest question that we just got through. So next is parks. We have, the task force has recommended the use of a parks district. And one thing I'm wondering is if you have any more specific recommendations around the parks district. If you recall, Parks Director Jeff Watling talked about different possibilities with the Parks District and the revenue that could come with it. You could use it to replace or supplant some of the general fund contributions currently allocated to parks, or you could use a Parks District revenue to be in addition to the existing levels of revenue that the general fund provides. So the first option would be parks would have a reduced reliance on the general fund, and that money from the general fund could be used towards other projects in other areas of infrastructure. If you were to do that, then the revenues from a parks district would replace general fund investment and probably add to it. You know, you could frame it that way, that there's still more that can be done than is currently being done. Overall, increase the level of revenue going towards parks, but it would still be limited, since the goal would be to replace some of the general fund investment. Or the other option would be to have the revenue be in addition to current levels of revenue. And obviously that would be your go big or go home option on the Parks District. So we didn't really discuss that. I heard some ideas among council task force members throughout the discussions, one way or another. I heard a couple of those things, but it's another one of those things that we never really drove home. And I'm wondering if there is a general consensus on the body. Thoughts and discussions on this? I see there's a couple of questions.
It looks like, let's start with Kathy with a question.
Andrea, could you remind us about how much the parks gets now on average in an annual budget versus what the anticipated revenue should they be a parks district? I don't remember those numbers.
I don't either off the top of my head, so I'm going to have to look it up, but I can circle back with that information.
Okay, if you wouldn't mind, because I don't know that I could make an informed decision without that reminder. Thank you.
Yeah. And actually, I'm going to phone a friend, because I know that Robert is listening and Robert's on the line. So I'm wondering if Robert can take a look at the budget in terms of what's been budgeted out of the general fund for parks and the adopted budget for 2022. We also have it in our materials what we had thought that the Parks District could potentially bring in terms of revenues. And I think Robert has access to those documents. So hopefully, Robert, you're listening closely and can help us do some fact finding and remind ourselves. Thank you.
Can we give Robert a moment and then go ahead to Brad and come back to Robert? Go ahead, Brad.
Well, I'm certainly not in favor of this first paragraph, and it's something that our ad hoc team with the park board discussed as well, and collectively we're not in favor of that first paragraph. And I'll tell you why. You know, for one reason is that if you pull away general funds that have historically been going to parks, that puts a greater burden on creating a park district and more of an ask and more of a levy lift to be able to get a park district. From the tables, we were seeing about $2 million that is roughly being contributed to parks historically. Essentially, if you were to pull that $2 million away from the general fund, that means you have to ask $2 million more for a park district. And so that just puts so much burden on a park district that there's a greater chance for failure. I mean, when I did the numbers, I mean, it looks like we could probably achieve, you know, paragraph number 2 there by, you know, putting in perhaps 0.25 per thousand, you know, and there's more of a likelihood of that being approved by the community. So that's one item. The other part of this is that, you know, essentially parks and infrastructure related to parks should be a part of, you know, of the general fund, which has happened historically. And to me, it's a little smoke and mirrors to pull general funding away from parks and now use a park district to essentially make up for that. Essentially, you're asking the community to almost contribute to parks for other things, but if you do it that way. And so I guess those are really the two reasons that I would say that I'm really opposed to this first paragraph, and think the second paragraph makes a lot more sense. The general fund contributes to, close to $2 million a year, and a park district could actually add to that to enable sustainable funding for the 6-year CIP and beyond. So, thanks.
Thanks, Brad. Susan? Oh, I'm sorry. Before you go, did Robert want to get back to us? I do think it's an important question.
So I just wanted to clarify Kathy's question. We have a lot of buckets of money as far as parks. So we have different ones, and I think before I got here, I know there was materials in your packet about that. But we have the general fund funding. We also have funding for revenues we receive from recreation programs and from parks facility rentals. If you think about all the facilities in the city, that generates revenue as well. So we have that, and then we also have the capital bucket. And then we have the needs of the capital. And in addition to that, we also have the open space acquisitions that the city does for the green initiative. So there's a lot out there. Are you just looking at maybe how much we're underfunding the projects at this point? And is that what you were looking at, the CIP itself?
That's a great question. Boy, you don't know what you don't know when you ask a question, right?
Sorry.
Yeah. So I would have to say I was thinking more just G&A, the way my mind works, not the rental facilities, not acquisitions, not any of the rest of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because that does go into paying staff. That does go into paying the program. So that's why it's hard to just
right. No,
I can get you a ballpark of we're underfunding. It might take me a day or two to get back to you, but I can say we're underfunding our projects by X amount. We use X amount of percentage of general fund for operations. That might give you a better sense of where we're at.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
I'm going to go out of order and ask Jamie to ask your question.
Yeah, I just had a question related to Kathy's question. I mean, it sounds like, Robert, from what you're saying, that there's two kind of capital buckets. There's the capital projects and then the land acquisitions, which I would expect is most relevant to like our discussions around capital infrastructure projects. Does that make more sense as the part of the general fund that you're looking at, or for this discussion? I'm just wondering if like G&A and like operating expenses is really relevant to what we're looking at, or as relevant as the capital expenses.
I'm just going to get back to you as soon as I can regarding just the true operations, because when you throw in some of the larger acquisitions, you throw in even some of the largest capital projects, and you're talking about some state supported funding, you're talking about grants. So I'll just try to narrow it down as much as I can to say, this is what it costs to run our parks department. This is how much revenue we're taking in. And this is roughly each year what we need to spend on capital to maintain our parks. I think that'll give you a good base, hopefully.
Susan?
I'd love to see something that is a little bit more in between and not necessarily an either or. And so I was looking back at the first paragraph and the word some pops out at me. I'm wondering if others would be interested in saying, we wouldn't recommend a, complete zeroing out right away of general fund, but over time, as money comes in from the Parks District, that money should be used for two purposes. One, investments in new things, but then also to reduce over time the reliance on the general fund for ongoing maintenance. And it just seems like there's an opportunity. And if others are in agreement, we could indicate an intent to gradually reduce the reliance on the general fund.
Tim.
You know, as I look at the two options on the screen, I definitely think it would be, I would prefer the latter, right? I think it's disingenuous if we go with a parks district and folks vote for it and say, I'm willing to pay for that and I'm going to get parks for my money. And then the level of service and investment remains the same, or there's some fungible component to it, right? I think it says something about our credibility if that's the way we operate. I'm not opposed to a park district. And I think, you know, if I'm a voter and that's what I'm voting for, then I would assume that those funds are incremental increase. And there'll be some sort of return on investment in terms of parks for it.
Thanks, Tim. Councilmember Martz.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm plus oneing on Brad's original comment. Two things about it. I like disingenuous is one of my favorite words. So thanks, Tim. Yeah, this thing where you generate a new source of revenue because it's going to help expand whatever, and then you just play shell games with money and then expand basic government. That happens all the time, right? States, almost every state that ever put a lottery in place was gonna go to help education, and all they did was just move education expenses off the line items out, and education didn't get bigger, just government got bigger. Which is, so yes, the disingenuous, and B, it just gets at this whole government appetite, right? And whether government just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger relentlessly, which is a reason to vote no. So when worded this way, I'm strongly in favor of the second item. Thank you.
I'm going to say that I thought this is a really important question, and I think it's kind of related to what Zach said in the last meeting, as I made some notes during watching the recording, and that's that strategy doesn't necessarily have to match the priority. So you could just say we want to fund transportation, and we're going to just take more of the general fund and then find another way to pay for things out of the general fund. So I kind of flirted with this idea strategically because there's so much more of an appetite for parks, but I think I kind of came to the same conclusions about disingenuousness and shell games, and it's also just a little bit, yeah, I don't think it's yeah, it's disingenuous, I think, even though I think it was an interesting strategy to contemplate. And Zach, I don't know if you remember making that comment, if I interpret it correctly, but I think it was just a question of like, we could have a lot of different strategies on how to pay for things. They don't have to match the priority. And this was an example where you could maybe make the strategy to be about what can pass versus, you know, and you don't have to match the tool with the priority. Did I get that right? Kinda? Yeah, okay. So I'm not hearing anybody opposed, and I'm hearing everyone gravitating towards the second paragraph. This maybe could be done with a thumbs up. Is there anyone, wait, I'm sorry. Okay, except Susan wanted to add, wait, okay, I didn't do that very well. I should leave it to the professionals. Andrea, do you want to help us reach some kind of goal? Or it doesn't have to be a poll, but like, what do you?
So
Oh, Stacy has a comment. Thank you. Sorry about that. Let's hear Stacy's comment and then figure out how to reach a conclusion if we have one.
Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm just thinking it differently or confused, but I guess to me, I'm certainly not opposed to the first one. I kind of depends on, I guess the part that I would like refined at some point, it doesn't have to be tonight, but my feeling is that replace or supplant some, it depends on what that is. So if we're looking at a parks district that encompasses something broader than the city, then maybe those are funds that some people broader than the city should help pay for. And so maybe I'm just thinking about it a little differently, or maybe I'm just confused, but I'm not opposed to number one, depending on how it's refined and if we have more information about specifically what we would supplant to be paid for by Parks District funds. So anyway.
Looks like Brad has a comment. Go ahead.
I just wanted to throw in here one more piece, because this is something that we have talked about within the ad hoc team. Jeff had actually given some clarification to us that Seattle Parks had actually gone through a park district here somewhat recently. And this particular topic was something that came up when they developed that. And as it turns out, they specifically, when they drafted that district for Seattle Parks District, they drafted it to be able to maintain existing funds that were previously devoted from the general fund to Seattle Parks. So essentially, Seattle Parks, when they drafted their parks district, went with, the second paragraph rather than the first paragraph. And I guess I just wanted to bring that up, that, here you have a very large park district in Seattle that has already kind of vetted this particular topic, and that's what they came up with. And that's somewhat similar to what our discussion has been here tonight. So just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Kathy has a question.
Sorry, having troubles unmuting there. Everybody's comments are making my head spin. I'm a little bit even more confused because with the Parks District and with our goal, we're looking at funding CIP projects. And so I guess I have another question of how much, what do we have in the CIP now as far as dollars to fund? Because it seems to me the Park District is bringing in another element that I wasn't quite prepared for, and that was the everyday budgeting and continuing that. And I'm not disagreeing, but is the Park District again, the Park District would be created to fund items in the CIP. How much is in the CIP? How much do we feel would be an annual amount needed? In other words, I guess, Brad, I don't know what the parks would like to add in on an annual basis, but once the park district is formed, this becomes regular annual revenue to pay for new parks, would it not? Because that's what we're talking about. So I just, again, don't remember how much funding was needed with the CIP projects that are in there now, and what an annual amount of new CIP projects would amount to, and if the park district funding would be enough or not enough, or excessive. I just don't know. So I'm more confused. I'm sorry.
Andrea, go ahead.
Thank you. I think I can help clarify a little bit. And so as you may recall, the Parks District is interesting because, as you said, we can use Parks District money for capital needs as well as operations and maintenance. So it can be used for both. And I'm just going to pull up some of the information that we have looked at in the past. So it's been a while since I've shared my screen, and I don't think I am able to here. Shoot. So, okay, I will just, the Parks District, from the materials we've shared in the past, the estimated revenue that we could get if it was kind of maxed out the revenue option there is 10.2 million on an average, on an annual basis, 10.2 million with the Parks District. When we look at the current average annual need just for the next 6 years of the CIP that we have planned, at 6.6 million in assets. And so, in projects. So that's just for the next 6 years in the CIP. 6.6 million is kind of the average annual need. And so this Parks District could bring in significantly more than that. It could be 10.2 million. As to answer your other question earlier, in terms of general fund support of the operating, that's about 7.8 million per year. And so, so there's some room to play here given the data. And I'm sorry that I can't just show it to you right now, but hopefully that summary is a little bit helpful to understand what scale of numbers we're talking about. Is that helpful at all, Kathy?
Andrea, is the 6.6 million total existing in the CIP right now all projects, or are you talking about 6.6 annually?
Annually.
Okay, so we've got the 7.8 in the general fund, and we've got the $6.6 million anticipated annual needs in the CIP. Then that helps.
That's an average over the next 6 years, but yeah.
Thank you.
Zach, go ahead. Oh, never mind. You sure? Okay.
Well, I found the numbers in the CIP, and I'm not sure if it would be helpful or not now to share more numbers. So maybe I'll just hold off for now.
So it seems, so I guess I could return us to the question. There's been some very good discussion. And I'm wondering if now is a good time. It sounds like what I'm hearing a couple people say they maybe could go with the first paragraph if there were a couple modifications. But there seems to be a preponderance of folks leaning towards the second. And so is it useful at this point to take a poll? No, Tola says no. But I saw a really big thumbs down from Susan when I said, but I wasn't sure if I was misinterpreting. So it wasn't very precise. And so polls are a little time consuming, but maybe we could start by saying the simplest thing. Put your thumbs up if you basically have a full-throated response to choosing the second paragraph. And maybe somebody can, there's 1, 2, Jamie, come on. Oh, you don't. Okay, I'm sorry. 1, 2, you don't have to vote, but this is just, I can't count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so only 5 people are good. Did I do that right? Did someone else count? I think I only saw 5 people that said they would right now go for number 2. Are the other 6 of you saying that you would actually right now say number 1? Because that wasn't what it was as much reflected in the discussion, I guess. So, and then maybe Jamie, go ahead and make your comment, and then I'll ask that question again.
Zach, you want to go? I think you might have stuck in right ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, thanks. I was just going to say, I think Susan and Stacy kind of convinced me that there is more, there's more to this first one, and especially flipping through the Parks and Trails, the first paragraph, especially flipping through the Parks and Trails section of the CIP. There are some things in here that are more like trail maintenance, building up the fund for our turf replacement programs that are really would probably be more appropriate to have a consistent revenue source to apply that to. So I was just thinking maybe we could say something like the majority of the task force is in favor of the second paragraph, although now it doesn't necessarily seem like that, but would also encourage the city council to think about what funding would be most appropriate for programs in the CIP that are renewing and consistent. So that was just going to be my suggestion.
Go, Jamie. Thank you, Zach.
So my comment was similar to what I said on the last, as we were wrapping up the last one, is I do wonder if we're trying to put things in too close of boxes. And I do think that I feel like you could almost make 3 choices here. It's we commit to never having funds come out of the park, like that you have to do what Seattle does, which is like 100% commitment. There is the opposite of that, which is we're going to use it to fund other things, or there's 2 is we're silent to it, and that's maybe beyond the scope of what our task force needs to get to. And I wonder if this is really the level of detail we need to get to on this particular topic, given that it's further out. So I just wonder if we should be seemingly again we have a lot of different opinions if we're trying to get too close of a definition on this right now.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Absolutely. I think that's a great question and a great point. I mean, you know, what Director Watling had talked about previously is that if there is to be a parks district, then there's going to be a whole committee and a process of folks to determine the scope of that parks district, right? And so I brought this item up, not wanting to give you all a headache and try to figure out all these options and really dive deeply. It was really to assess, are there strong feelings? Because I had heard a couple of comments through the process that maybe we could use revenues that are currently going to parks and use them to support other infrastructure. And so I didn't want to ignore those comments and wanted to make space to have that discussion. So what I'm hearing is there's not a strong feeling among the task force at this point to reallocate some of the general fund dollars that are going to parks. So I think that's great. That's really what I wanted to determine. Are there strong feelings? Is there a strong recommendation? That said, you have added a lot of comments and thoughts that we can add into the discussion section on this item and saying transparency is really important and that the city needs to be very thoughtful about the scope of this parks district and what a potential new revenue source would cover in regards to the district. So I appreciate the discussion. I don't know that we need to go deeper than this today. Really just was trying to make space for a conversation that I had heard some comments about, but we hadn't quite nailed down yet.
Andrew, I was just going to summarize and say, yeah, I don't think we're hearing an explicit strategy to have a parks district so that we can reallocate general fund towards a priority. That was something a couple of us flirted with, but I think we can be silent on it because we're not recommending that. And it sounds like nobody's really recommending that. And you're right, we got pretty nuanced about what a parks district might fund. And so that's great. It sounds like Jason said, never mind. And it sounds like we're ready to move on to number 3. Thanks, everyone.
Yep, that was great. So next question, after the parks question. So this was regarding additional revenues. Does the task force report currently convey the task force's position on the city pursuing additional revenues for funding capital projects? And so if you're following along with the report, this is really referring to one of the earlier recommendations, which is, let me find the exact page so you can follow along with me. Recommendation number 3, which is on page 4 of the report itself. Recommendation number 3 says, the city should pursue additional revenue for infrastructure instead of maintaining current levels of funding or reappropriating funds from other expenditures in the city budget. We had a brief conversation about this as a task force, and it was one of those conversations that everybody just kind of said, yes, we should pursue additional revenues. And as the discussion outlines underneath that recommendation, the conversation was at the time that it didn't seem as though there would be reallocating dollars to infrastructure probably still wouldn't get the amount of infrastructure projects that the community wants done. It wouldn't accomplish those things, that we have a lot of needs. And so there was, I think, unanimous support among the task force to pursue additional revenues. But we didn't have an extensive conversation about that. And I just wanted to be sure that this language was something that the task force was comfortable with moving forward. And so, and I think there was a comment I received from a task force member wanting to discuss this just a little bit more. So this is your opportunity to tell me did I get the language about right? Are you comfortable with this recommendation? Are you not comfortable with this recommendation? And also noting some of the points made in the discussion, and if you have any additional considerations, because I didn't fill that section out. Additional considerations in this report is really where we can put in dissenting items or things mentioned by task force members that maybe are in the minority, but are still certainly something we want to convey to the city, the administration, and council. So what are your thoughts on this recommendation, and does it meet the general voice of the task force?
So I would encourage you, I think this is a really, really, really important question, because if we're going to go, I think that we all are so much in agreement that I don't think we've really, in really clear language, articulated the rationale for against the no action option. And so I see there's a couple people ready to make comments, but I really would encourage us to be brief, but just think about that. And I'd love to hear from as many people as possible. Go ahead, and I think Brad was first on the comment in the chat. Go ahead, Brad.
Actually, I'm the one that posed this to Andrea to take a brief look at this. And for me, it's not so much that we don't pursue additional revenue sources as much as has enough scrutiny occurred with the existing allocations and existing budget reviews. I happen to be a tighten your belt kind of guy, and of course I'm old school too here, I suppose, but I tend to believe in the concept of living within your means. And I think that the community, in some respects, may feel that as well. And so to me, I think at least enough analysis needs to occur to determine, is there a part of the budget that could be reviewed to consider at least some additional allocation or reallocation of funds towards infrastructure. With the amount of growth that has occurred within this community, some of the money that has come in may not have been allocated enough over time towards infrastructure. And that's my concern, is at least that we need to take a look to make sure that there isn't something within the budget that could be reapportioned to at least contribute to some additional infrastructure. I think that the community would be more supportive of new revenue sources if that were to occur, because then they would see at least, well, you're doing all you can as a city, with the amount of resources that you currently have, to try and apportion some of that towards infrastructure rather than operations. And perhaps could actually then support additional revenue tools, because that has occurred. So that was really the basis for my comment. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. Susan.
Yeah, I also like the idea of scrubbing the budget, and I guess I assumed that would be done and is being done and has been done by the city and city staff. And I'm not sure if we were supposed to do that, or if we really would have the insight and information to do that task. So I guess I kind of liked how you summarized it, Andrea. And to me, that the comment, I guess midway through the paragraph, that says, the task force believes the city to be generally fiscally responsible and does not believe reducing current expenditures on programs or staffing would provide the amount of funds needed. So I guess maybe should we say pending an additional, budget exercise, or pending, annual review of sources and uses or something? Or do you expect us to kind of go through that exercise before we land on that paragraph? But I guess I felt like we were all sort of nodding our head that, yep, there's more need than we're going to be able to wring out of the out of the sponge. So definitely let's wring the sponge, but then let's quickly kind of align on what's next after that. And then one other quick thing is, in this list of sort of like checking down the possible areas, you mentioned ARPA funds, but that doesn't come until later. I wonder if, again, kind of unique point in time where we are in history, we've got this, you might call a windfall, that's coming our way. And of course we would use that first. That is, if that's coming our way, goes without saying, uses it first. And we don't even talk about like going back to the taxpayers until, there's good application of those funds. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Jason.
Thank you, Chair. And I am all in favor of having a clean checkbook and living well within our means. The city has slashed their resources in the last 2 years quite a bit. I don't know if everyone's aware, but city resources, city staff have been slashed. And I don't necessarily think by continuing to cut, we're going to make any type of real difference in terms of being able to fund capital projects. So yes, I am in favor of going after all sorts of additional revenue sources that the state, well, I know we have wizards in City Hall that sit around and play with numbers all day. Even if it's someone who's tasked, their whole job is to go up to Olympia and lobby or see how they can get grants. I know it's a little harder at the federal level, but just someone whose basically their job is dedicated to finding monies out there for the city. I go back to the same comments made earlier about as far as, who's using our city, right? So you think infrastructure or transportation, people are using our roads from all over the place, and parks and trails. People come to Issaquah from all over the place to go hiking, to go up Tiger Mountain, Cougar Mountain, come to the zoo. So all sorts of people that don't live in the city use the city. So I think it's only right and appropriate that we're out there looking for funds everywhere. And again, the city took a major hit in 2020, not as bad as we thought, but in terms of releasing staff and part of their brain trust, that's gone. And fortunately, the city didn't do as bad as we thought. But there's only so many things you can slash. There's only so much of the budget you can scrub, and it's not going to make a dent in terms of the CIP. So yeah, we need to be aggressive. We need to be going out there and to find monies everywhere that we can, because again, it's not just about Issaquah growing in the next 10 years, which it definitely will. It's about all of the impact that we have from all of the people that come to travel and play in our city. So I think that would be a good thing to do.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, I would say this, not only would I agree with the statement that we need to explore new revenue opportunities, I think you could summarize this whole report, this whole process with that line. We need to explore new revenue opportunities. The reality is there's a backlog of projects. They cost a lot, right? If we can get another $1 or $2 million or $2 a year, blood from a stone, and tightening our belts, it's not going to make a dent. And so at some point we do need to look for additional revenue, right? If you look at our annual budget's 50 million and we've got 300 million of projects or whatever it is, we're not going to get there unless we take some action in terms of raising revenue. There's this kind of this notion that development pays for itself, and as an average citizen, I can sympathize with that. But the more I've been involved in this now for over the years, I know whether it's fair or not, that's just not the case. And the growth of the city has necessitated some infrastructure needs we haven't kept up. And in order to take action and address what's clearly the number one issue, we're going to need to raise some more revenue.
Thanks. Councilwoman Marks?
Thanks. So the city does do an annual thorough budget review. And of course, the mayor brings us a thoughtful, articulate budget, and then we take 15 or 20 hours and soak it in red ink and pull stuff out, and sometimes we add stuff. But I mean, the council takes that very seriously. And the net effect is this thing that I talk about every year that some of you may or may not know about: real expenditure per capita, which is take correct for inflation, right? Because inflation happens, and then look at the size of your city. All basically over a long time frame, all of our departments in the city are either flat or going down in real expenditures per capita. And I think that's super important. I think anybody should be able to walk up to any elected official in the city and say, hey, are you being a wise steward of our money? And this looking at how our expenditures go down per capita or stay flat is the way that I can look people in the eye and say that we've been doing that. Right. So the punchline is unfortunately, there's not coins sitting around in the seat cushions. We've looked for them. We look for them every year. We find a few. But if we're going to address infrastructure issues, we've had incredible growth. We haven't been able to put infrastructure in place to support that growth, and so now we have to find some ways to do that. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you for that work, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia. I agree with what this recommendation is saying in general, is that we believe that that we should be looking for additional revenue. I question the framing of this in that it's because we have reviewed, it almost is implying that we've reviewed the city's budget, that we think that it's the right level of spending, and then that's why we need to go do this. I think we should be changing the framing of this to, we have seen the CIP, we think there's compelling projects and things that the city and the people around feel are important, and that's why we're recommending this, because I think we need to take regardless of your views on whether the city's being fiscally responsible, I think we have to take the assumption that should be not something we're having a statement on, but that's table stakes coming into this task force. And so I really think that the focus of this section should be more on, we think there's compelling projects that are stacking up that we need to go out and find funding sources for, not focused on budget reallocation or those pieces.
Thanks, Jamie. Zach.
Thanks. I was going to say, I think this discussion paragraph actually is a good summary. I think this meets my needs in terms of what I'd like to see in the final report. I did want to echo what Tim Flood said, though. I think the backlog is one part of why we've come to this decision of why we need to explore new revenue sources, and the other is maybe we need to explore adding a sentence about the pace by which we're accumulating the funding for these projects. And I think that is evident through the community survey that we have, with the transportation still being everyone's top priority and people not seeing improvements in that. So I think maybe adding something about the pace of capital funding would be helpful in this paragraph.
Stacy.
Thanks. So I generally like the paragraph, except the first sentence. It says, after reviewing the CIP, including the unfunded projects, the task force concluded the current level of spending does not appropriately provide for the current and future needs of the community. That seems to be the problem statement about why we're here in this task force. So I think I would take out that sentence or rewrite it, because that's kind of why we were formed, to figure out how we're going to pay for things. So, but I don't think that we reviewed the CIP. Maybe we did. I don't recall that we made a specific conclusion, but that seems to be the specific reason why we were formed, because that was a fact that had already been decided. In terms of comments about scrubbing the budget, that is a recurring theme that we hear, and certainly, everybody can save pennies here and there. To me, it seems like the bigger issue, rather than scrubbing and redirecting, is that there are increasing demands for city monies to be used on emerging issues, and it seems like ongoing long-term issues oftentimes get pushed further and further into the background. So I think if it's I don't know that that's appropriate to put in here unless we want to put something about encourages the city council, the city and the city council to keep its sights set on the long-term priorities and needs of the city when it's also considering competing interests or competing or emerging interests. I think that's the larger concern, is that we just continually have newer issues come up. You know, right now there are, you know, a lot of, you know, social issues, things that we have to deal with. So so anyway, those are, but I generally like it. Don't get me wrong, I generally like it. Thanks.
So we did hear a couple different points of view about this paragraph and about, I feel like we pretty much vetted the whole scrubbing the budget thing. But I think Jamie made a really good point, and so I guess I'm wondering, Andrea, how you're feeling about it. Maybe you're capturing this better than just trying to figure out what the next move is, because I've heard a few different things, all of which are really thought-provoking.
Yeah, I'm taking lots of notes about these comments, and what I'm hearing is general agreement with most of the sentiments within the recommendation, but tweaking some of the sentences and languages, making sure the focus is staying on the CIP, and that and not the budget, but rephrasing that first sentence. So I'm hearing just some general tweaks, and also talking about pace was another thing that I'd heard of, which we did not really address. So I think it's just a matter of adding and subtracting to the wording that's there, but the general sentiment is accurate to the recommendations from this task force. So that's all great. Thank you.
Are you guys feeling like that? I feel like maybe I was hearing some different things, but is there anybody that feels like they would disagree with her assessment? Okay, then I guess we can go ahead and move on. My goodness, are we? It's a time check. It's 8:08. I noticed we went over on the last one. I don't like to do that. I know we already set an extra half hour on this one. I noticed that we still got overshot last time. Maybe it's a good time before we move on to number 4. I'm willing to break my rule about finishing at the specified time because we're such late stage, if everyone is able to do that. I just always have a real, I just really hate when I think there's a fairness problem when someone has to leave at the time that we said it would be finished. Is there anyone that has an issue with going a little bit later? Oh, Jason does. Okay. So do you have a hard stop at 8:30, Jason?
There's the mute button. Yeah, thank you, Chair. Unfortunately, I do have to dip out. I've got an early morning flight, so still have
Okay.
a couple things to do.
So let's see how far we can get by 8:30, and then let's take an assessment, and if we have to press on without him, we just need to make sure that we're remembering that we're missing somebody who's going to miss out on that conversation. So that always causes me a lot of angst, but let's not dilly-dally any longer. Let's jump into number 4.
Great. And Jean, can you pull that slide? Great. Thank you. Okay. So I think this is our final question for this facilitated discussion. So financing versus pay-as-you-go. Does the report reflect the task force's position on debt financing and bonding versus pay-as-you-go? And I'll just draw your attention to the correct part of the report here, which is on page 4, it's recommendation 4. The recommendation 4 states, the city should take on additional debt as appropriate to fund higher cost infrastructure instead of paying for infrastructure on a pay-as-you-go or cash basis. And so the recommendation I think I heard in our last meeting, and we have some notes in that the meeting minutes even refer to this, but the discussion portion is definitely something that I've woven together over our several months of meeting and based off of different task force members. So in particular, what I heard last time, smaller projects may be able to pay on an as-you-go basis. These larger projects, financing might be more appropriate for purposes of generational equity, and also that the city is using less than its legal debt capacity. That was something we had discovered or discussed way back in October. So we provided some information on that. And then other reasons for this recommendation is that generally best practice, as I think Robert discussed, or PFM, our financial advisors, best practice in financing is to take on debt for the life of the asset. That was something that they offered. And then there was a big focus in the discussion about maintaining a AAA bond rating. And so that's what I heard from last time in terms of reasons for that recommendation. I just wanted to hear if that sounds about right to you, or if you have other comments on this one.
Jamie.
Thanks, Cynthia. Andrea, could you just make sure, this was really helpful when we talked about this on our meeting, but the difference between councilmanic and like other forms of debt that we might go after, because that was like eye-opening to me. Councilmanic, that's a crazy name. It's still funny when I see that spelling of that. But that was really helpful for me, and maybe it would be for others, because I just wasn't something I understood up to this point.
Sure. So I'm going to refer back to the report for additional feedback and consideration section. It says, when determining the types of debt the city should take on, the task force encourages city council to consider councilmanic bonds when appropriate to the type of project. The task force acknowledges that voter-approved bonds can be an appropriate tool, but these are high risk given the increased requirements for passing. The task force is concerned voter-approved bonds do not have a strong success rate in Issaquah and the region for many types of infrastructure. And again, that was something that was very much woven and interpreted over time through the discussions. We talked about councilmanic bonds versus these other bonds that are available, the voter-approved bonds. Council has, and I'm going to forget the threshold, but has the ability to approve bonds up to a certain dollar amount. And then beyond that, we can go to the voters to see if they would approve of a bond at that much higher level. And so what I had heard is to be cautious about what is taken to members of the public from to vote on, and that if the city can use, if the council can use their powers to take on more debt, then they should do that instead of necessarily putting every bond towards a vote of the people. On an annual basis, the city council does approve certain bonds for within their kind of authority, dollar threshold and authority. So it's not an uncommon tool for council to do. So this discussion is basically referring to that. Is that what you were hoping I would say, Jamie, or did I miss something?
Yeah, and I think the only other piece is, and I don't know if Councilmember Martz, I feel like I've heard him say this number before, but is that threshold, because that does seem like an important of like what the authority is for councilmanic. And maybe you don't know, but I thought I remembered you saying that in a previous meeting.
This is Robert. I can hopefully answer that. It's you're going to go for a bond at 60%, but it also is measured on voter turnout. So it has to be an election after an election that had, and I apologize, I don't have it right offhand, but a certain amount of people participating in the previous election. So there are some caveats to going for a bond.
And that's stipulations on the bond vote and what would make a bond vote successful. I think the question is, what is that dollar threshold? How much can council, through their own authority, approve before we are forced to take it to the voters? And I know we did cite that number in a previous meeting. I wish I had a perfect memory and could remember what that number is, but maybe Robert can try to look it up real quick. It's a significant amount. I just don't remember what that number is.
Robert, do you want a minute? Should I let another person comment and then come back to you? Okay, great. Kathy.
Thank you. I just want to say I agree with the comment and the sentiment behind it for many reasons. You know, dealing with CIP and getting those projects completed is not always a pay-as-you-go situation. Some of them are quite lofty and have big dollars attached to them, and there's no way we could possibly accomplish those using a pay-as-you-go formulation. They just sit there forever and ever. Two, we've grown significantly, so it stands to reason that our needs are going to greatly exceed what we could do realistically in a pay-as-you-go, and things continue to get more and more expensive. So doing a pay-as-you-go and thinking today we need X number of million only means tomorrow we need X number of more millions of dollars to create or to pay for those projects that are sitting in the CIP. So I do think it's a strong statement to encourage the City Council to look at expediting and taking on that debt to get some of these projects done.
I'm not seeing a bunch of people jumping to talk about this. I think we're all pretty much, the answer is basically is generally yes. Yeah, I think we're.
Great. That's great. And the number that I think Robert's trying to do some math on is 1.5% of the assessed value, total assessed value of the city land or land within the city boundaries is the threshold in terms of council-manic authority on debt. So they can, through their own authority, approve as much as 1.5% of the assessed value. And I think Robert's trying to do some of that math right now, which I appreciate. I see Councilmember Martz has a comment.
I just looked away for 1 second. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's two separate questions, right? There's a limit to what council can authorize, but previous councils historically loaded that up, and then over time that debt is paid off, and so the capacity grows. When I started on council, it was pretty small. I want to say the current capacity is something like $30 million. I don't. Hopefully, Robert can get a more specific number. It's on the order. It's more than 10 million. But I just want to reemphasize with everybody that's got to be paid back, right? So whether you ask the voters for 10 million or you council wakes up tomorrow and says we want to spend 10 million on this, that money has to be paid back either way. So it has to come out of general funds or whatever. But there's the amount of money that's available. We haven't used council-manic bonding authority, I believe, since I've been on council. It's just the capacity has grown and grown and grown and grown. So, like I said, it's a 8-figure number. I just don't remember exactly how big. Thanks.
Looks like Jamie has a comment.
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia. One of the things I'm wondering that's not said in this right now, but we may want to say is that I think the understanding is we would take on more debt, assuming we get a revenue source against that debt. And that's what we're doing with some of the other recommendations. So maybe I think that's what we're saying, but that isn't actually said in there that we may want to consider.
Great, thank you. So if everybody's kind of generally, well, poor Robert's still taking the pop quiz that we keep giving him. Oh, I see there's another comment.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say the other thing that I remember from our last conversation is again, I think everybody is pretty much in agreement. Big thing was as long as it doesn't hurt our bond rating. And I remember that once that came up, that was I think everybody's eyes, but what? That could hurt our bond rating. So that was very, very critical piece to it too, as well.
Yes, great. So I think, so I'm not hearing a lot of disagreement. I think we can still get that number for you in terms of real dollars, what that councilmatic authority is. But if you're ready to move on, I'm ready to move on. I feel like I've gotten the feedback that I needed.
That's great. I feel like there's this little lines as additional edits as determined by the task force, and that's that could be really, really loaded. I came with one question that is actually fairly substantive, and I don't know how many other people did. Show of hands, how many people feel like they have a substantive comment on the rest of the report? Just me. Oh, Jamie. Okay. Well, okay. Well, that's not too bad. It's 8:22. I'll let Jamie go first and we'll see where that takes us. And then I'll just tip my hand that mine is about the ARPA funds. And I'd like to see us tighten that a little bit and maybe be a little more forthcoming, maybe see if we can reach something. But I'm going to go ahead and let Jamie go first.
Yeah, mine was just around, so we have the table, it's one of the last pages which has the revenue potential of some of these different tools. And I do wonder, I know it's said, but I do wonder if we should be more explicit that these are not, like, we haven't discussed these as being the specific amounts we think we should be going out with. And maybe everyone feels it's clear enough, but that was my one concern, is there's specific numbers in here. Someone that doesn't read really closely might see those as being our recommendation on how much we should do. And I just think we need to be really careful because I don't think we've had that conversation.
Thank you. It is described in the paragraph above, but we can try to modify the tables to make that more clear so the person who's not reading that paragraph understands that these numbers are plug-in numbers that were used during the process. So we'll try to make that more clear. Thank you. Scrolling through the report did remind me, as we were looking at these tables, facilities, this table has no assigned revenue. I think that's the recommendation moving forward with task force. It seems like there's some types of revenues that could be applied to there, but nothing was specifically stated by the task force to fund facilities. We want you to pursue this revenue tool, right? And so, and that's what I've heard kind of reinforced in the discussions tonight, that there's things that can be applied, but there's no suggestion like parks should be, we should think about a parks district or TBD revenue. So, we can certainly summarize that in the report as well, since that seems to be the recommendation moving forward. Okay, great.
So my comment was, after watching, having not been able to attend, but watching, I felt like I wanted to take another crack, and here it is at 8:24 at the ARPA. It seemed awfully watered down, and I thought it was interesting that we came to such a clear priority on the long term and medium term, but with these tools that are available now, And so I think I couldn't tell if it's just people getting tired or I'm not sure, but I strongly feel that those ARPA funds should reflect the priorities that we came up with, because when we came up with those priorities, we said these are the problems we have now that we are seeing now. And I do think it's appropriate that we don't make really specific recommendations or we put caveats in there about what the administration thinks is shovel ready. So I think there was a lot of discomfort with the idea of, well, we can't possibly say what should be moved up first. But I did want to put that out there to see if this group was amenable to being a little tighter on that. And I'm scrolling because I can't remember what page that was. There we go. I just feel like that we could have something a little bit more pointed. And I have to read it again to see the language, but it just seemed that it was not very committal. How many people here would feel comfortable saying that we should generally steer ARPA towards the number one priority, and not to the exclusion of the other two, as the administration feels is appropriate in terms of what's actionable in the tight time frame? Is that something you guys, or do you really feel like oh, I see a little hand there. I see. Yeah. So maybe a thumbs up if you feel like you are willing to consider strengthening that, or if you kind of like it. If you're willing to consider strengthening, I see 1, 2, and not others. So and 3, I think maybe, I don't know, somebody moved their hand. 167 million. Okay, I know Brad has a comment and Jason has.
All right, that was just I was just trying to beat Robert to the punch. So page 18 of the Tuesday, November 16th Community Task Force meeting has that information. So our capacity stands at the moment at $167 million. So I was wrong. It wasn't an 8-digit number. It was a 9-digit number.
Okay. Wow. Okay, so maybe I'll just ask for a specific response to that in the just couple remaining minutes that we have. The comment about prioritizing generally ARPA funds towards transportation, not exclusively, but priority. Sorry. So I don't know if these comments are in specific answer to my question. That's why I didn't know where to start. So Brad, do you have a comment about my comment?
Yeah, I do. I do think that it could be tightened up a little bit. I guess my proposal would be maybe, approximately 60% towards transportation, 20% towards infrastructure of facilities, and 20% to parks. Just loosely, across the board with more of an emphasis on transportation. I saw in the write-up about trying to have everything completed by 2024 rather than 2026. I didn't realize that the federal government guidelines were that you had more time. I guess I would be more inclined to say not to try and complete everything within 2 years, knowing how much it takes in planning and design work and then construction and all of that. I guess I would propose maybe extending that a year, to at least have everything in place, but not necessarily have everything expended within 2 years. At least it gives everything 3 years in the short term. And then I think that it'd be really nice to tighten up the timing of, how we're going to proceed, with these various priorities. I pointed out to Andrea, at least in my write-up, I do think it's probably worthy of getting started a couple years ahead of time to at least do analysis and prepare for a rollout of something. So, for instance, I think if we're going to pursue a TBD in transportation, that could start maybe in a year from now, with the expectation of maybe having funding available in 3 years. For a parks district, 2 years before you would need funding. I'm opposed to 6 years out. So, or if you are, I would be looking at trying to get funding at the earliest of that range rather than the longest of the range. And I think if you get started a couple years ahead of time when you need money, you could maybe actually have money for transportation within 3 years, and maybe have the money that you need for parks within 5 or 6 years at most, rather than to just getting started in that midterm or long-term range. So thanks.
Thanks, Brad. I'm going to skip to Jason because I know you said you had to leave. And I'm hoping that we won't talk much longer after you go, but maybe a couple minutes. Go ahead, Jason.
Appreciate that, Chair. Yeah, so as far as what we're talking about, so I think for one thing that I've noticed, and I don't know if this helps the deputy administrator, but I think there's a lot of consensus on a lot of things. I think where you're seeing a little bit of maybe not so much is maybe the timeline. But I kind of like the idea of the ARPA funds, and I could even go with Brad's suggestion of 60-20-20. I think the number that I used on the very first meeting was 50-20-20-10. So that's pretty much in line. Councilmember Hall said something another meeting, maybe 1 or 2 ago, about possibly using it because those ARPA funds have an expiration date. And I believe it is 2 years, but that could be used for design. It doesn't necessarily have to be a physical transportation shovel job, whatever the city deems. I mean, again, that's the great thing for the administration and city council to work together. Really, all we're trying to do is provide a strategy. And again, I think this is probably the only place where I guess I might have a very different point of view is just timeline. And I just think the next, like I said, and I've already said it 100 times, but I just think the next couple of years is just let the city calm down, become whole again, and using the ARPA funds, the ending fund balance, using even camera revenue, just for the next year or two while everyone's getting their head around what's going on. And to Brad's point also, yeah, I mean, again, probably disagree a little bit with him about numbers, but yeah, he's absolutely right in the sense that I do concur that none of this stuff, even if you're expecting to get the Metropolitan Parks District revenue going, I think I wrote down 6 to 8 years. You can still start the work 4 years so it's ready at 6. I think I had the levy lid lifts at 3 and the TBD closer to 5. But again, I still think they're all valid tools to use. I think that's probably where you're seeing the biggest discrepancy, at least with me and my fellow colleagues. I think it's just really more of a timeline thing. So yeah, that's kind of where I would put the ARPA funds. I think I like Brad's numbers just fine, 60-20-20, and then let the administration and city council work out exactly what that looks like. Again, if it's more feasible, like Councilmember Hall said, to do design and drafting, great. It's still part of the transportation. It's still work that needs to get done. If it's an actual piece of equipment or something in that nature, then that's great, but letting them have the discretion to do it. But I think those numbers break down pretty general to even, like I said, the first day and kind of looking at that community survey. So I'm comfortable with all of it. Thank you.
Okay. We're close to being able to wrap up in time. We have Kathy and then Susan, and I don't know if people have other comments, but go ahead, Kathy.
So some of the conversation we had around ARPA, as I remember, was that it's not a very big amount. And when we're not supposed to be looking to see which projects are in the bucket, it's really hard to know if a single project or, again, multiple even research could be done with that small amount. I will also say that I feel a little bit greedy on this subject because I know that those ARPA funds can be used for economic development. They can be used in other areas of city governance to make itself whole. To think that what's left in the ARPA funds, and again, as I recall, it's less than $10 million, so not a lot of money. I feel comfortable leaving it vague because it's a once in a lifetime but again, small amount of money, and to just assume that it's all ours to put in the 3 buckets that we want to put it in, I don't know, because again, I know that there's other departments out there with other needs than ours. So I liked it when we were leaving it a little bit vague.
Shoot, I know it's 8:35, but I think we're offering up 2 different points of view. So I think we need to just hang with it for a few more minutes and see if we can get a sense of whether the majority or whether we're really just totally split. Susan.
Okay. Well, so I think I'm going to align with the point of view that Kathy just put out there. I think the best thing we can do as a task force is to articulate the principles, which we've just been doing all along here in this report, the priorities, the buckets, the funding mechanisms, and then turn and I think we could go further and say, hey, we think ARPA funding is a good opportunity to invest in infrastructure, because that's part of the name of things. And we, of course, are looking at a lot of infrastructure priorities as we've discussed over the weeks. But then I think it's going to have to be turned back to the city and the staff to basically say, okay, in the CIP, which are the ones that are most time sensitive and time urgent? Let's spend it there. And other than just sort of like, we hope that you will take our guiding principles of transportation number 1, parks and facilities number 2 in mind and put it toward infrastructure. And then I think we turn it back. I don't think we take a position.
Zach, go ahead. We are at, go ahead anyway.
Yeah, well, thank you. My comment's not about this because the paragraph on ARPA perfectly met my needs. I think this is fine how it is. So I had another thing I wanted to bring up, but I can wait until we wrap this up.
Let me just say that I think that what Susan just said is I'm really amenable to that. And I don't think that's really even called out like that. I think that I don't think that that is, I don't even think that kind of guidance is in this language to follow the priorities. So, and in fact, the first bullet point is cybersecurity and connectivity, which was mentioned, but I think that what you just said isn't captured in here. And I think that maybe at first I was liking the idea of the percentage, but I think maybe that's too prescriptive. And I think just the simple language you described could really enhance this. And then, and I feel a little uncomfortable with the first bullet point being cybersecurity and connectivity, because I think that was mentioned. And I think that's an interesting comment, but it just sort of makes it sound like it was just a bit like we didn't have any opinion at all, and all these things were equal. And I don't really think they're equal. I think we've said transportation was important. Can we carry that to this just generally and not be prescriptive? Are people amenable to that? In a manner that Susan just mentioned. I'm saying a couple of nods and then some blanks. Okay, well, it's late. I don't quite know what to do with this. I feel like I'm still curious about a couple of you are thinking. Is there anybody that is opposed to including that direction in this written section? Go ahead, Tom.
Can I suggest the hour is late, and can I suggest the language be written as draft language? We're gonna meet again, and we're gonna do a final review of everything, and it could be put in as proposed language, and we can get closure on it the next time we meet.
I was thinking the same thing, but I think we're running out of time to meet, but I think we'll figure it out. Let's go ahead and maybe wrap with Zach's comments and then finally give you guys the rest of your evening back. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. There are just a couple of things identified in the report. Most of them we got to on page Andrea, on page 4, right before recommendation 3, it looks like the additional feedback and considerations paragraph gets cut off. So I was just wondering if someone could read off the rest of that for the group, and if we just want to do that at the next meeting, that's fine. But I just wanted to point that out, that I'm not sure what the rest of that paragraph said.
That's page 4 after
Right.
recommendation 3. That
Right before it, yeah.
Oh, right before it, certainly. Trying to make that happen here. I can include that language. It did get cut off somehow, so I can.
I'm sure it's great, and we're all going to love it, but we just want to know what it is.
Absolutely, yeah. You'll see that in the next version for sure. Thanks.
Okay. And then real quickly then, to Kathy's point earlier in the meeting, on page 6, as part of recommendation 6, it says a minority of the task force are concerned that the sales tax may make Issaquah a less attractive place to shop and do business, ... I know at the very end of the report, we say that each revenue source, the city should conduct additional outreach, ... But I think in the discussion paragraph of recommendation 6, it might behoove us to say direct and substantial business outreach, in particular about a sales tax, would be recommended before or as part of the process of moving forward with this. Thanks.
Okay, well, there was a couple, 4 or 6 little words, and we didn't need that much time for them after all. So I think that's a huge testament to Andrea and Jean really working really hard to capture everything that we said. So well done. Do we have any other business?
Just wanted to talk about the next meeting. Yes, thank you everybody. Great, just great discussions. So the next meeting is our last meeting. And I think, let me try to pull up the agenda here, but I think wanted to talk about the date of the meeting. Typically we meet on these Tuesdays. Unfortunately, again, we're facing another government holiday that's kind of getting in the way of some of our task force meetings. So there's President's Day on the 21st, which means that the council meeting that would normally be on the 21st is moved to the 22nd, which is when our typical meeting day would be. So I'm wondering if there is consensus around the 23rd, that's a Wednesday, to meet on the 23rd instead. Seeing lots of thumbs up. Okay. And that would just be at our regular time, 6 to 8 on the 23rd. Tim cannot make the 23rd. So what we can do is we can send out alternative times. This being our last meeting, this meeting I think is important to have everybody there who can be there and provide those recommendations to Mayor Polly. So let's talk about what's on the agenda for the 23rd. The first part of the agenda would be reviewing the draft with all of the changes that you've suggested this evening and making sure it says what you want it to say. That would really be the first half of the meeting. Then the second half, moving on to having Mayor Polly join us, and you can provide your recommendations to her. So quick presentation. I know that she will want to hear any other insights or things that are important to each of you regarding these recommendations. And then she has a few questions that I know she wants to ask you about your recommendations and about the process that you followed in these task force meetings. And so that's the next meeting. After that, on March, oh boy, I don't want to get this wrong here. March 7th, we are scheduled to go to City Council to then provide the recommendations to City Council. So what the mayor has asked is that Cynthia and Jamie as chair and vice chair would provide the presentation, but that as many of you attend as possible to be able to help answer council questions and to be able to speak to certain points in the recommendations. And so that would be on March 7th. So that's kind of where we see our next steps in going. Any questions about the next meeting or the presentation to City Council so far? Okay, great. So we will, I'll ask Juliana to send out a poll to try to identify other times. I know we're running up against spring break for some folks, and so it might be challenging to find a time that we can all get together, but we still want to make that March 7th City Council meeting. So we will try to find a time that works for everybody. It just may not work because of kind of where we are in the year and in the month, but we will certainly try to find a time for everybody first. Okay. Great. That's all that I have for you tonight. Thank you again so very much for your wonderful discussion and feedback. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thank you. See ya.